Chapter 24. The Dream of Reason. With the Enlightenment, men's hopes for the future turned from God to reason. Reason would, men believed, solve all problems and advance mankind to a new golden age. But the Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers already believed that a golden age had existed in Greece and in Rome, yet both cultures fell. As Frank E. Manuel pointed out, quote, "The apprehension of many 18th century philosophes over the internal decay of their society was reinforced by the haunting fear of another barbarian eruption from the heart of darkness that would overwhelm Western civilization in a repetition of the awful spectacle of the fall of the Roman Empire." End quote. Edward Gibbon wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire as a warning of what could happen, and also to blame Christianity for destroying the Golden Age. In France, Diderot and others wrote the Encyclopedia with a like motive. For the Christian, God cannot be overthrown or supplanted, and therefore there is no cause for pessimism as to the ultimate outcome. As Psalm 2 tells us, the ungodly conspire together against God and His Messiah, but God laughs at their thinking. He holds them in derision. The psalmist counsels submission to God as the only way to escape God's judgment. The Enlightenment substitutes for God its idea of inevitable progress. The French Revolution began the erosion of this faith, and World War I ended it. Current New World politics is the last gasp of such thinking, but with a difference. Instead of a natural evolution into a permanent golden age, it was now to be obtained only by revolutions, tortures, mass slave labour camps, and the like. The noble dream of reason had become a nightmare. For Descartes, reason was a method, but, with time, man's contempt for this method was more in evidence than his trust in it. Reason was the property of the intellectuals, and they were increasingly held in contempt by others. Although the intellectuals created a refuge for themselves in the academic community, it was a fragile shelter. Great masses of peoples were given admission into that academic community, but the life of reason was not enhanced by this. As a result, the life of reason became political correctness, not reason but coercion. As we have seen, Gertrude Himmelfarb has called attention to this shrill hostility to anyone who writes negatively about Stalin and his reign of terror. Moral judgments and, quote, judging Stalin, end quote, are coded, quote, moral imperialism, end quote. Of course, these critics are deeply involved in moral judgments, and they are denying simply the right of judgment to their Christian critics. The moral imperialism is on their part. They are in agreement with the Marquis de Sade that only Christian standards are untenable and that all naturalistic ones are tenable. The Enlightenment dream of progress was of an orderly development, building on the foundations laid by others who preceded us. But with the revolutionists who steadily replaced the Enlightenment thinkers, this sense of order was replaced with an insistence on disorder and discontinuity. Peter Tchakev, who was the theoretician of revolution by professionally organized conspiracy and who influenced Lenin, had as a basic premise that all Russians over age 25 be put to death, quote, as incapable of moving with the times, end quote. The American student movement of the 1960s had a related motto, quote, never trust anyone over 30, end quote. This was a rejection of the past, and with it went a rejection of the family and an insistence on anarchic sexuality and morality. The rejection of the past went hand in hand with a rejection of reason. The Enlightenment faith in reason gave way to an equally absurd belief in science and technology as a road to utopia. Lenin was an example of this. Quote, in his own words, communism in Russia would be achieved when the whole country had access to electric power, end quote. He said also, quote, electricity will take the place of God, end quote. This sounds very naive to us, but it is hardly less so than the hopes routinely expressed today by politicians, educators and scientists. For the Christian, man is no less a sinner than he was 1,000 or 5,000 years ago. As Samuel Moffat commented, shortly after World War II, the invention of atomic power makes no more difference to man's moral problem than the invention of the bobby pin. But men idealize both the past and the possible humanistic future because God's version is anathema to them. Their dreams are anti-God and pagan. Poets have idealized the Irish pagan centaur Tara, as did the novelist Margaret Mitchell in Gone with the Wind. They believe that if God could truly be made dead, then man would be free. But man, while idealizing freedom, denies it in practice, and in our long history, slavery and tyranny have been more in evidence than freedom. Man routinely indicts God by idealizing himself. Dante, in Purgatory, Canto 16, has Marco Lombardo say, quote, "So if the present world is astray, seek the cause where it is in yourselves. And I shall give you now verified report from the hand of the Creator who loves. His work before it was being. The soul issues in perfect innocence, like a babe which cries, laughs, frolics, knowing nothing but joy in its parent, and turning gladly to what delights it." End quote. Dante here is a precursor of Rousseau. He does not give us a Christian perspective as does Paul when he writes, quote, "Yea, let God be true, but every man a liar." Romans 3:4. To indict God is to reject not only God, but any conceivable ultimate moral order. The hostility to what the cultured despisers of Christianity call, quote, "moral imperialism," end quote, is an animosity to any ultimate moral order, that is, one given by God. Man's original sin is to be his own God, knowing or determining for himself what is good and evil, law and morality. Genesis 3:5. Given this premise, it follows that moral autonomy becomes man's starting point. Autonomy means literally self-law, and at the heart of the modern spirit is this intense religious conviction in man's autonomy. As Cornelius Van Til pointed out, quote, "The idea of grace is wholly out of line with the idea of autonomous man," end quote. Grace is the antithesis of autonomy, which is why the modern university and the church-related college give no place to grace. The curriculum of humanism too often prevails in both places, and grace is alien to the autonomous intellectual's view of scholarship. The premises of education are always religious, and in our world, if they are not systematically Christian, they will be humanistic, as they are. The doctrine of grace tells us that creation was God's gratuitous act, not necessitated in any way. Moreover, life is covenantal, and both the law of the covenants and its mercy represent God's grace. We are, in all our being, evidence of God's grace. As St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4:7, quote, "Who maketh thee to differ from another, and what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now, if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory as if thou hadst not received it?" End quote. The whole of the modern age, perhaps more so than previous ones, because it has been so generously blessed by God's favours, is militantly anti-grace. The perspective of autonomy separates all spheres and all men and things from God, whereas the clear vision of grace is our total dependence on grace. But a world stripped of all grace would be no more than hell, and modern man's vision of life in the future is a hunger for hell. The Christian must separate himself from this disastrous goal. The dream of the golden age without God is a vision of hell.